To fully understand what you're about to witness, we need to go back to what happened just minutes before. During a discussion about leadership on Inside the NBA, Charles Barkley had attacked Steph Curry in a merciless way. He questioned Curry's faith, called his humility weakness, and went so far as to say that Steph hides behind religion because he doesn't have true courage. These were brutal, personal attacks that cut deep into the soul of a man known for his kindness. But then, something extraordinary happened. Curry didn't retaliate. Instead, he did something no one expected. He transformed each attack into gratitude. He revealed how Barkley had been one of the greatest inspirations of his life. He demonstrated such genuine Christian love that it left the entire TNT studio in complete shock. And now you're going to see what happened when a heart hardened by decades finally surrendered to the transformative power of true love. Have you ever wondered what sound an emotional wall makes when it finally collapses? In that TNT studio in Atlanta, you could hear exactly that. Not a physical sound, but something much deeper, as if decades of defensiveness were fragmenting before the eyes of millions of people. Charles Barkley remained seated in his chair, but something fundamental had changed in his posture. His large hands, which moments before had gestured aggressively while attacking Curry, now trembled slightly on the table. It was impossible not to notice that something monumentally transformative was happening behind those eyes that had always radiated unshakable confidence. The silence that followed Curry's response was different from any other silence that studio had ever witnessed. It wasn't the tense silence of a heated argument. It was the reverent silence of people who had just witnessed something sacred. How is it possible that some words have the power to completely change the atmosphere of an environment? Stephanie Brown, production director who had supervised hundreds of episodes of the show, felt a chill down her spine that she couldn't explain. In her 15 years working with sports television, she had never witnessed such a visible transformation happening in real time. It was like watching a soul being touched by something divine. Barkley swallowed hard. The sound was almost audible through the microphones, revealing how dry his throat was. Not from lack of water, but from emotions he hadn't visited in decades. His eyes, which minutes before had shone with competitive aggression, now carried something completely different: raw and undeniable vulnerability. "Steph," Barkley began, but his voice came out different. It wasn't the voice of the confident commentator who had dominated discussions for years. It wasn't the voice of the former player who intimidated opponents. It was the voice of a man who had just been touched by something he didn't know how to process. The word came out choked, loaded with emotions he was desperately trying to control. Something that touches deeply is when we witness the exact moment someone realizes they spent their entire life building walls that were actually prisons. Curry remained silent, his eyes transmitting a patience that invited Barkley to continue, but without pressure, as if he understood that this moment couldn't be rushed. Samantha Davis, veteran audio technician, instinctively adjusted the sound controls. She could perceive through the headphones that Barkley's breathing was irregular, as if he were fighting against some very powerful internal force. It was possible to smell emotional tension in the air, mixed with the soft aroma of coffee that still lingered in the studio corridors. Barkley tried again, but his words were lost in a sigh that carried the weight of 60 years of life. His hands moved toward his face, as if he wanted to hide, but then he lowered them again, as if he were fighting against an instinct of self-preservation that had dominated his personality for decades. Kenny Smith and Shaquille O'Neal exchanged discreet glances, both realizing they were witnessing something that completely transcended basketball. What's most impressive is how some moments manage to reveal the humanity behind the public personas we know. It was as if all masks had fallen simultaneously. Ernie Johnson, with his decades of experience mediating difficult conversations, instinctively leaned slightly forward. His professional instincts made him want to intervene, create a smooth transition, protect Barkley from the vulnerability being exposed live. But something bigger was happening there, something that shouldn't be interrupted. "Man," Barkley whispered, and now genuine tears sparkled in his eyes. Not tears of anger or frustration, but tears of the kind that arise when decades of pain finally find an outlet. You just did something I didn't know was possible." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when the entire studio realized they were witnessing one of the most authentic transformations ever captured by television. Lauren Miller, camera assistant working behind the scenes, completely stopped what she was doing. How many times in life do you witness someone being broken and rebuilt simultaneously by the power of genuine love? Curry maintained that characteristic serenity, but it was possible to perceive that even he was moved by the magnitude of what was happening. His own words had planted a seed that was now flowering in a way even he couldn't have predicted. 58 years, Barkley said suddenly, his voice gaining a clarity that contrasted with the emotion in his eyes. 58 years I spent building walls, building this armor, and you, in 5 minutes, showed me I was building a prison. It was impossible not to feel that something fundamental was changing, not only in Barkley, but in the very atmosphere of the studio. Megan Garcia, associate producer watching through the monitors, felt tears rolling down her own face. How is it possible that one person's vulnerability can touch so many other hearts simultaneously? "When I was a child in Alabama," Barkley continued, and now his voice carried a confessional quality that made the entire studio fall completely silent. "I learned that crying was weakness. I learned that vulnerability was danger. I learned that to survive, you had to be tougher, stronger, more relentless than everyone around you." The smell of transformation was literally in the air, not a physical aroma, but that palpable sensation that arises when something deeply significant is happening. Christina Lopez, who had returned to the studio for a follow-up story, found herself hypnotized by what she was witnessing. "And for 60 years, Barkley said, his voice now trembling with uncontained emotion, "I carried this hardness like a trophy. I thought it made me strong. I thought it protected me. But you just showed me something I never understood before. Great things happen when no one is looking. But sometimes the greatest transformations happen when millions of people are watching, witnessing the power of love to break even the most hardened hearts." Barkley paused, breathing deeply as if gathering courage to say something he had never verbalized before. His hands stopped trembling, as if he had finally found a source of strength he didn't know existed. "What would you do if you discovered you spent your entire life fighting against something that could actually have been your greatest blessing?" "Steph," he said finally. And now there was a resolution in his voice that made the entire studio realize something even bigger was about to happen. "I need to ask you something, and I need to do this in front of everyone who's watching, because everyone deserves to hear this." It was possible to perceive that Barkley was preparing for something that would change not only his own life, but also deeply touch the life of anyone who witnessed that moment. True strength was about to be demonstrated. not through aggression or intimidation, but through the courage to be completely vulnerable before millions of people. But what happened next would change everything forever. In that moment, Charles Barkley did something that surprised even those who had known him for decades. Instead of trying to regain his usual composure, he allowed himself to sink even deeper into the vulnerability that was taking hold of him. It was possible to perceive that something inside him had decided that 60 years of pretending to be invincible was enough time. "Steph," Barkley continued, his voice now carrying a quality no one in the studio had ever heard. It was the voice of a man allowing his true heart to speak for the first time in decades. "Do you want to know why I attacked you so ferociously? Why I was so cruel? Have you ever wondered what leads someone to build walls so high that even they can no longer see what's on the other side?" Curry remained silent, his eyes transmitting a compassion that invited Barkley to continue his journey of openness, without judgment, without haste, just genuine love, waiting patiently for the truth. Rebecca White, assistant director who had worked with strong personalities throughout her career, felt a different energy permeating the studio. It was as if the very walls were absorbing decades of pain that were finally finding an outlet. The emotional smell in the air had changed. It was no longer tension or hostility, but something deeper, like the aroma of earth after a purifying rain. "Because," Barkley said, and now tears rolled freely down his face. Tears of a man who had spent 6 decades trying to convince the world he was incapable of crying. "Because when I see you with your family, when I see you talking about faith so naturally, when I see you being vulnerable without fear, I get jealous of something I never knew it was possible to have. Something that touches deeply is when we witness someone discovering they spent their entire life hungry for something they didn't even know existed." Shaquille O'Neal, who had witnessed Barkley in moments of victory and defeat for years, had never seen his program companion so completely stripped of pretensions. "I grew up in Leeds, Alabama," Barkley continued, his voice now gaining strength through vulnerability, "in a house where showing emotion was seen as weakness. My father left when I was little, and my mother did the best she could, but she had also learned that to survive as a black person in the South of the 60s, you had to be hard as iron." Danielle Harris, senior producer who had documented thousands of hours of sports television, realized she was capturing something that completely transcended entertainment. How is it possible that a discussion about basketball evolved into such a raw confession about character formation and generational trauma? The silence in the studio was so profound, it was possible to hear the almost imperceptible hum of recording equipment. Kenny Smith, known for his ability to find lightness in tense moments, remained completely motionless, recognizing he was witnessing something sacred that shouldn't be interrupted. "At 10 years old," Barkley continued, and now his voice carried the weight of memories he had buried for decades, "I learned that men don't cry. At 15, I learned that vulnerability is an invitation to be hurt. At 20, I had built a personality that was practically impenetrable, and for 40 years, I carried this armor as if it were a medal of honor." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when Barkley began to reveal the real cost of decades of emotional invulnerability. His hands, which always gestured with absolute confidence, now moved differently, as if he were literally stripping himself of layers of protection he didn't know how to remove. "Do you want to know what the irony is?" Barkley asked, and there was a sad smile on his face that mixed pain with a kind of liberating relief. I spent so much time trying to prove I was strong that I never learned what true strength really means. Until today. Until you showed me. Catherine Clark, video editor who was following the recording for possible clips, felt a chill run down her spine. What's most impressive is how some revelations manage to touch universal wounds that we all carry. That struggle between authenticity and self-preservation that defines so much of the human experience. Steph, Barkley said, leaning slightly toward Curry, when you spoke about your faith, when you transformed my attacks into gratitude, when you showed me love at the moment I least deserved it, you broke something in me that I didn't even know was broken. It was impossible not to feel that something monumentally transformative was happening. Brittany Lewis, production coordinator, watched through the monitors with tears in her eyes, realizing she was documenting one of the most authentically human moments ever captured by television. "Do you know what moment touched me most?" Barkley asked, and now there was a clarity in his voice that contrasted with the emotion in his eyes. "It was when you said I had inspired you when you were a child. Because I spent so much time focused on intimidating, on winning, on proving superiority, that I never stopped to think that maybe my true strength was in the capacity to inspire instead of intimidate." Vanessa Walker, veteran lighting technician, subtly adjusted the studio lights. She could perceive that the facial expressions of both men were loaded with an emotional intensity that deserved to be captured with perfection. It was like watching two souls connecting on a level that transcended any superficial differences. "And when you prayed for me," Barkley continued, referring to moments in the previous video when Curry had clearly made silent prayers during the attacks. "When you literally prayed for someone who was attacking you. Man, you showed me what God's strength operating through a person looks like. How many times in life do you witness someone having a spiritual revelation in real time?" Curry nodded softly, his own eyes shining with tears of gratitude. Not tears of pain, but tears of the kind that arise when you realize God used your words to touch another person's heart in a way you never could have planned. "I need to tell you something more," Barkley said, and now there was an urgency in his voice that made the entire studio realize he was preparing to reveal something even deeper. "When you spoke about trusting in something greater than yourself, about finding strength in faith, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood." Andrea Hall, audio assistant who monitored every sound nuance, could perceive that Barkley's breathing was becoming more regular, as if each spoken word was literally releasing decades of accumulated tension. It was possible to feel the aroma of transformation in the air, not a physical smell, but that palpable sensation that arises when something deeply significant is happening. "I felt hope," Barkley said simply, and these two words carried more weight than any elaborate speech could carry. Hope that maybe it's not too late to learn a different way of being strong. Hope that maybe I can discover this peace you have. Hope that maybe I can stop carrying so much hatred and start carrying more love. Great things happen when no one is looking. But sometimes the greatest transformations happen when someone has enough courage to completely strip themselves of their defenses before millions of people, demonstrating that true vulnerability is actually the most powerful form of strength. "Steph," Barkley said finally, and there was a resolution in his voice that made the entire studio realize he was preparing for something that would change not only his own life, but deeply touch anyone who witnessed that moment. "I need to do something I've never done on television, something I've never done publicly, and I need to do this because you deserve it. because our audience deserves it, and because I deserve to finally be honest about who I really am, underneath all this hardness. It was possible to perceive that Barkley was gathering all the courage 60 years of life had given him to do something that would completely redefine how the world saw him, and more importantly, how he saw himself. No one could imagine that moment would be the turning point. Charles Barkley breathed deeply. It was possible to hear through the microphones the depth of that breath. It wasn't just air entering the lungs, it was the breath of a man preparing to do something that would change his life forever. The entire studio seemed suspended in time, as if even the cameras were holding their breath, awaiting what would come next. "Steph," Barkley began, and there was a quality in his voice no one in the studio had ever heard. It was the voice of a man completely stripped of pretensions, speaking directly from his soul. "I need to ask your forgiveness, not just apologies. Forgiveness. Have you ever wondered what the difference is between apologies and asking for forgiveness?" In that moment, everyone in the studio could feel the difference viscerally. Apologies are about acknowledging error. Forgiveness is about acknowledging hurt caused and seeking genuine healing. Melissa Young, recording supervisor who had captured thousands of hours of television throughout her career, felt a chill that ran down her entire spine. It was impossible not to realize she was documenting one of the most authentically transformative moments ever recorded by television. The emotional smell in the air had changed again. Now it carried that indescribable fragrance that arises when something sacred is happening. "I attacked you," Barkley continued, tears rolling freely down his face while his voice gained strength that came from a very deep place. "I attacked your faith, attacked your character, attacked everything that's most sacred to you. And I did this not because you deserved it, but because I was afraid." Amy Robinson, veteran camera director, instinctively adjusted the focus. Something that touches deeply is when you witness someone having the courage to name their own failures without trying to protect themselves or minimize the impact of their actions. It was like watching an act of pure courage being executed in real time. "Afraid of what?" Curry asked softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that invited Barkley to continue his journey of vulnerability without judgment. "Afraid of discovering I spent 60 years of my life being the wrong kind of strong," Barkley responded, and now his voice trembled with an emotion so raw it made the entire studio fall completely silent. "Afraid of realizing that while I was intimidating people, you were inspiring them. Afraid of accepting that while I was building walls, you were building bridges." How is it possible that some confessions have the power to touch universal wounds that we all carry? Kimberly King, senior producer watching through the monitors, felt tears sprouting in her own eyes. It was as if Barkley's vulnerability was creating a safe space for everyone in the studio to process their own struggles with authenticity versus self-preservation. "Steph," Barkley said, leaning toward Curry with an intensity that made the studio air seem electrically charged, "when you responded to me with love instead of retaliation, when you transformed my attacks into gratitude, when you showed me how true strength manifests, you didn't just respond to me, you saved me." The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. It was possible to feel as if waves of emotion were propagating through the studio, touching each person's, present in a deep and personal way. Ernie Johnson, even with decades of experience mediating difficult conversations, found himself completely speechless before the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "Saved me from a lifetime of carrying anger as if it were strength," Barkley continued, his voice now carrying a conviction that seemed to emanate directly from his soul. Saved me from dying as a man who never learned the difference between being respected and being loved. Saved me from spending the rest of my life without ever experiencing the peace you have. Naturally, this leads us to the moment that would change not only the lives of those two men, but also deeply touch anyone who witnessed that demonstration of genuine humility. Nicholas White, chief sound engineer, could perceive through the equipment that even Curry's breathing was being affected by the emotional intensity of the moment. "And I know," Barkley said, his voice now broken by emotions he had repressed for decades. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I said things that cut deep, that questioned your faith, that attacked everything most important to you. But Steph, I'm begging you, forgive me. Forgive me for being so small in the face of something so great. What would you feel if someone who attacked you publicly demonstrated such genuine repentance that you could literally feel the transformation happening?" Curry closed his eyes for a moment, not to hide from the intensity of the moment, but to access that source of wisdom that always guided him in the most important moments. "Charles," Curry said when he opened his eyes, and there were tears rolling down his face. Not tears of pain, but tears of deep gratitude for witnessing the transformation of a human heart. "I don't just forgive you, I thank you." Jonathan Harris, technical supervisor who had worked on the program since its creation, had never witnessed such a complete emotional turnaround. How is it possible that two words, "I thank you," have the power to completely transform the dynamics of a situation? "Thank me?" Barkley asked, clearly surprised by Curry's response. "Yes," Curry responded, his voice now loaded with an emotion that transcended any difference that might have existed between them. "Because you gave me the opportunity to experience God's love, operating through me in a way I had never experienced before. You allowed me to discover that my faith is stronger than I imagined." What's most impressive is how true forgiveness not only frees those who are forgiven, but also transforms those who forgive. Samuel Clark, who had returned to the studio for this special session, could perceive that something fundamentally different was happening in the environment's atmosphere, as if the very air had been purified by such a genuine demonstration of grace. "But more than that," Curry continued, and now there was a passion in his voice that made the entire studio pay total attention. "You taught me something about courage I had never understood before. Because what you just did, opening yourself like this, allowing yourself to be vulnerable before millions of people, that's the purest courage that exists." Benjamin Lewis, who had returned to the studio as a special observer, felt a lump in his throat. How many times in life do you witness two people elevating each other through shared vulnerability? It was like watching two souls finding healing simultaneously. "Charles," Curry said, extending his hand toward Barkley, "thank you for showing me that true strength isn't never breaking. True strength is having the courage to reconnect after breaking. Great things happen when no one is looking, but sometimes the greatest transformations happen when two people choose to be completely authentic before millions of witnesses, demonstrating that love and forgiveness have power to heal even the deepest wounds." Barkley looked at Curry's extended hand for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. It was possible to perceive that he was processing not only the forgiveness offered, but the very possibility of a human connection based on mutual vulnerability instead of competitive strength. "Steph," Barkley said, his voice now carrying gratitude so deep it seemed to emanate from decades of unrecognized need. "You just gave me something I didn't know I was looking for 60 years. You gave me permission to be human. And it was when Barkley extended his own hand to meet Curry's that the entire studio realized they were witnessing something that completely transcended sport, television, or any superficial differences. They were seeing two human souls finding healing through the courage to be completely vulnerable with each other. Timothy Walker, who had observed hundreds of interactions in the studio over the years, had never felt such transformative energy. It was impossible not to feel that handshake carried decades of pain being transformed into hope, decades of isolation being transformed into connection. "I love you, brother," Barkley said, and these four words carried more power than any elaborate speech could carry. "And I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of man who honors what you taught me today." It was possible to perceive that in that moment something fundamental had changed, not only in those two men, but in the very atmosphere of the studio. What began as a hostile confrontation had transformed into one of the purest demonstrations of love, forgiveness, and transformation that television had ever captured. And it was then that the truth finally came to light. What happened next wasn't planned, wasn't scripted, and certainly couldn't have been predicted by any of those present. Steph Curry stood up from his chair and walked toward Charles Barkley. It wasn't a theatrical or calculated movement. It was the instinctive movement of a heart recognizing another heart in the process of healing. Have you ever wondered what sound two souls make when they finally meet without masks, without defenses, without pretensions? In that TNT studio, it was possible to hear exactly that. Not an audible sound, but something much deeper, as if decades of loneliness were being transformed into connection before the eyes of millions of people. Barkley also stood up, his movements revealing a vulnerability that contrasted dramatically with the physical confidence that had always characterized his presence. It was impossible not to notice that something fundamental had changed in his posture, as if he had finally deposited a burden he had carried for 60 years. The embrace that followed was different from any embrace that studio had ever witnessed. It wasn't the quick, masculine embrace typical of sport. It was the embrace of two men who had found courage to be completely vulnerable with each other. It was possible to feel as if waves of healing were propagating through the studio, touching each person present in a deep and personal way. David Rodriguez, who had returned as special technical director for this session, felt tears rolling down his face as he watched through the monitors. Something that touches deeply is when you witness the transformative power of love operating in real time, breaking barriers that seemed insurmountable just moments before. "Thank you," Barkley whispered in Curry's ear during the embrace, his voice loaded with gratitude that seemed to emanate from decades of unrecognized need. "Thank you for teaching me it's possible to be strong and vulnerable at the same time." Kenny Smith, who had observed that transformation from the beginning, found himself unable to contain his own emotions. How is it possible that two people's vulnerability can create a safe space for everyone around to process their own struggles with authenticity? His own tears flowed freely, without embarrassment, as if Barkley and Curry's example of courage had given permission for everyone to be human. "Guys," Ernie Johnson tried to speak, but his voice was also choked with emotion. In decades mediating sports conversations, he had never witnessed such a genuine transformation, so completely stripped of pretensions. It was like watching two souls being simultaneously broken and rebuilt by the power of genuine love. Shaquille O'Neal, known for his extroverted personality and constant humor, remained in reverent silence. What's most impressive is how some moments manage to touch places in us we didn't even know existed. His own experiences with vulnerability and authenticity were being reactivated by the courage demonstrated by the two men before him. When they finally separated from the embrace, both had tears rolling freely down their faces. Tears that weren't of sadness, but of that type of deep emotion that arises when something that seemed impossible becomes real. It was possible to perceive that moment had changed not only their lives, but also redefined what true strength means for everyone who witnessed it. "You know," Curry said, addressing not only the other commentators, but also the cameras capturing every second of that transformative moment, "I grew up watching Charles play, and he always taught me about passion, about playing with heart. Today, he taught me something even more valuable. He taught me about courage. The courage to allow yourself to be broken so you can be rebuilt." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when everyone in the studio realized they had witnessed something that completely transcended entertainment. Marcus Williams, who had coordinated audio capture throughout the entire episode, could perceive through the equipment that even the collective breathing in the studio had changed, as if everyone was literally inhaling hope and exhaling years of accumulated cynicism. "Steph," Barkley responded, his voice now carrying a clarity that contrasted with the emotion in his eyes, "you gave me something I searched for my entire life without knowing I was searching for it. You gave me peace. And more than that, you showed me that peace isn't weakness. Peace is the most powerful strength that exists." Ashley Williams, who had observed that transformation from behind the scenes, felt as if she were documenting one of the most significant moments in modern television. How many times in life do you witness two people elevating each other through shared vulnerability, creating an example of humanity that inspires millions? "And you who are watching at home," Barkley said, addressing the cameras directly, his voice carrying a conviction that seemed to emanate directly from his newly transformed soul. "I want you to know something. I spent 60 years believing that admitting weakness was dangerous. Today, I discovered that hiding weakness is what's truly dangerous." It was impossible not to feel that those words were touching homes around the country, where men who had spent decades building their own emotional armor were being confronted with the possibility that vulnerability could be freedom instead of risk. "Charles is right," Curry added, and there was a passion in his voice that made the entire studio pay total attention. "The Bible says, 'God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble.' Today, I saw this grace operating in real time. I saw how God can use even moments of conflict to bring healing that none of us could have planned. Great things happen when no one is looking. But sometimes the greatest transformations happen when someone has enough courage to be completely authentic before millions of witnesses, demonstrating that love and forgiveness have power to heal even the deepest and oldest wounds." "You know what impresses me most about all this?" Kenny Smith said finally, finding his voice after minutes of emotional silence. "It's that when two men have courage to be vulnerable with each other, it gives permission for all of us to be more human. Charles and Steph didn't just heal themselves, they healed us, too." Rachel Kim, who had returned to the studio as official photographer, instinctively lowered her camera. Some moments are too sacred to be captured. They exist only to be lived, felt, and allowed to transform hearts. It was possible to feel the aroma of transformation in the air, not a physical smell, but that indescribable fragrance that arises when something deeply significant is happening. "And that's what I want my children to see," Curry said, his voice carrying a parental emotion that touched every person in the studio who had ever been a father or mother. I want them to see that real men aren't afraid to cry, aren't afraid to ask forgiveness, aren't afraid to admit when they're wrong. I want them to see that true strength manifests through love. What would you feel if you discovered your courage to be vulnerable inspired millions of other people to do the same? Barkley looked around the studio, his eyes capturing each person present, as if wanting to memorize that moment that had completely redefined his understanding of himself. "Folks," Barkley said finally, and there was a serenity in his voice no one there had ever heard. "I don't know how to thank you for witnessing this with me. You gave me a gift today. You gave me the chance to finally be honest about who I really am underneath all this hardness I built." Nicole Martinez, production assistant who had worked with hundreds of personalities throughout her career, had never witnessed such a complete and genuine transformation. It was like watching someone being born emotionally at 60 years of age, discovering aspects of themselves that had remained dormant for decades. "And Steph," Barkley continued, turning to Curry with gratitude that seemed to radiate its own light, "I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor what you taught me, not just about faith, but about how to treat other people with the same love you demonstrated for me today." How is it possible that a moment of conflict transformed into the purest demonstration of love and mutual growth? Perhaps because when two people choose vulnerability over protection, authenticity over image, love over fear, they create space for miracles to happen. "And for all of you who are watching," Curry said in conclusion, his voice carrying an authority that came not from position or achievements, but from a faith tested and proven, "remember that great things happen when no one is looking. But the greatest happen when we have courage to allow others to see our humanity. Because it's in our shared vulnerability that we find our true strength." The program ended that night not with sports analysis or debates, but with two souls who had found healing through the courage to be completely authentic with each other. And perhaps that's the most powerful lesson of all, that true love doesn't judge, doesn't condemn, and never gives up. It simply loves until love is the only possible answer. It was impossible not to perceive that something fundamental had changed in that studio, and by extension, in the homes of millions of people who witnessed that transformation. Because when we witness two people choosing love over hate, forgiveness over retaliation, growth over pride, it reminds us that we all have the capacity to choose who we want to be in the moments that matter most. And perhaps, in the end, that's the most beautiful truth of all, that it's never too late to change, never too late to grow, and never too late to discover that our greatest strength isn't in never breaking, but in our courage to allow ourselves to be rebuilt by love.